Welcome to Infinite Business Dynamics. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us for this explainer today. We're zeroing in on a massive challenge for enterprise leaders, project managers, and procurement professionals, and that is, how do you navigate highly volatile markets? Well, today, we're going to decode exactly how you can master Agile's fourth value to turn all of that market uncertainty into a serious competitive advantage. So let's just dive right in. The core theme of our structured learning session today is all about mastering the shift from rigidly following a set plan to dynamically responding to change. For business leaders, you know this isn't just some abstract theory. It's literally the operational difference between thriving in today's market and quickly becoming obsolete. Here's our blueprint for the session. We'll be covering 1. The new era of risk, 2. Rethinking the planning myth, 3. The engine of adaptation, 4. Agile procurement and contracts, 5. Agility and high stakes, and we'll wrap it all up with 6. A blueprint for adaptive success. Okay, starting off with section 1, the new era of risk. We really need to diagnose exactly why traditional, static planning is just falling flat in our modern digital economy. Think about a perfectly drawn blueprint that just gets crumpled up and tossed away. That's what's happening to predictive models right now. Globalization and rapid technological advancements have completely upended the business environment, meaning static plans become obsolete before they're even executed. As Reeves and Daimler so accurately point out in the Harvard Business Review, we live in an era of real risk and instability. Adaptability is the new competitive advantage. The firms that can pivot quickly are simply outmaneuvering the ones clinging to outdated roadmaps. I want you to take a quick second and just self-diagnose your own operations. Think about how a traditional predictive approach treats change. Usually it's discouraged, right? It requires endless formal change requests and carries a huge risk if market shifts are missed. Now contrast that with an agile adaptive approach. In that world, change is actually expected. It's incorporated seamlessly. Customer involvement is continuous, and success is measured by the actual business value you deliver, not just blind conformance to some original budget. So ask yourself, which approach does your organization actually lean toward? And that brings us to section 2, rethinking the planning myth. It's time to tackle the single biggest misconception I hear from business leaders. Here is the absolutely crucial point. Agile does not mean no planning. The idea that agility is just total chaos is a complete myth. The reality is a highly structured empirical loop. Plans are absolutely essential, but blind adherence to an uninformed starting hypothesis, that's a recipe for disaster. Software pioneer James Shore really hit the nail on the head here. He advises that you should think of your plan as a plan for learning just as much as it's a plan for building. You test every uncertainty, and then you adapt your plan based on reality. In reality, planning is distributed across multiple timeframes. Agile organizations are planning at every level of magnification. Zoom all the way out, and you have the vision and roadmap, spanning months to years, which remain highly flexible. Moving a bit closer, you have release planning based on a prioritized backlog. Zoom in further to sprint or iteration planning, which locks in scope for a few days to weeks. And finally, right at the center, you have daily planning for those constant micro-adjustments. Your high-level strategy connects seamlessly to daily actions. Building right on that, we arrive at this brilliant concept called rolling wave planning. The idea is that planning detail is heavily concentrated in the near term, say the next 2 to 4 weeks. As you look further down the timeline into the mid and long term, your pathways stay fluid and high level. You literally defer detailing the work until the actual information is available to you. This is a game changer because it prevents your teams from wasting massive amounts of time and effort detailing a distant future that is inevitably going to change anyway. Moving right along to section 3, the engine of adaptation. We're going to pop the hood and look at the exact mechanical framework that makes this continuous learning possible. Think of this as an infinite loop of continuous learning. Agile frameworks don't just tolerate change, they systematically process it. In fact, the Scrum Guide explicitly states that its events are designed to provoke change because inspection enables adaptation. It flows like this. You start with sprint execution, move to the sprint review to inspect the working increment with your stakeholders, and then you feed those fresh insights directly into the retrospective and backlog refinement. It's this perpetual, unstoppable engine of empirical learning. Let's break that engine down into 3 highly actionable steps. Step 1, you execute the sprint. This relies on a temporary scope block so the team can actually focus and build something real. Step 2, you inspect via the sprint review. This is where the rubber meets the road and you test your original assumptions against real working increments. And step 3, you adapt via retrospectives. You incorporate that direct feedback to revise both your plan and your team processes for the very next cycle. Now, I know that project managers tuning in might be feeling a little anxiety right now just hearing the words scope creep. But listen, structured flexibility is not endless chaos. Think of the sprint as the protective gate. During a sprint, the scope is firmly locked to allow for deep focus and flow. Random changes aren't allowed to disrupt the team mid-stride. Instead, they're politely cued the backlog gatekeeper. This means teams can pivot sharply between sprints while executing incredibly reliably within them. Let's shift gears completely for Section 4, Agile Procurement and Contracts. This section is absolutely vital for the procurement professionals and contract negotiators watching us today. Look, if you're trying to be an agile organization, but you're still using traditional predictive contracts, you are fighting a losing battle. Traditional contracts rely on rigid deliverable lists and massive upfront funding. What does that mean? It means any little market shift triggers incredibly expensive renegotiations or penalties. Agile procurement shifts that entire paradigm. It focuses on outcomes-based agreements, incremental funding tied to delivery phases, and flexible statements of work. Honestly, fixed scope contracts actively kill agility. So how do we fix this? There are 3 specific procurement shifts required to extend agility to your sourcing. First, prioritize outcomes over outputs. Second, use incremental funding to cap your financial risk. And third, engage in scenario planning. Major organizations like CPIPs advise defining alternative options and their cost implications upfront, and the US TechFar Hub strongly recommends designing contracts specifically to support agile efforts. Why? Because doing so dramatically cuts both time to value and overall project risk. All right, let's move into Section 5, Agility in High Stakes. I know some of you are thinking, sure, this sounds great for building software apps, but there is no way this works for my complex, highly regulated industry. Well, let's validate why that's actually a massive misconception. The reality is that adaptability scales across literally every industry. In low-regulation, high-paced markets, you have consumer tech giants like Netflix and Spotify thriving on continuous, data-driven pivoting. But it doesn't stop there. Even massive, highly bureaucratic systems, like the UK government, have reorganized into autonomous, agile teams to improve taxpayer value. And when we look at organizations facing extreme regulatory rigor, we're talking about heavy hitters like NASA and Tesla. This adaptability extends directly into the physical hardware space too. Take the Mars rover or an electric vehicle chassis as examples. The crucial lesson here is that regulated industries don't abandon Agile, they just integrate their compliance checks directly into the sprint. By testing for safety and compliance continuously, rather than waiting for a massive, painful bottleneck at the end of the project, you actually end up delivering a safer product much faster. Let's put some concrete facts to this. NASA actually adopted Scrum for their safety-critical engineering. The result? Shorter delivery times and the unprecedented ability for Mars rover teams to swiftly incorporate brand new scientific findings mid-project. Then you have Tesla, who applies Agile by essentially treating hardware like software. Every car has a digital twin, and they utilize extreme automated testing. That allows them to push updates to highly regulated hardware every few hours. Extreme adaptability absolutely works, for sure, even under the strictest safety constraints. Finally, we've reached Section 6, Blueprint for Adaptive Success. Let's synthesize all of these concrete business benefits and map out your next steps. When you present this entire concept to the boardroom, you have to focus on the tangible returns. Embracing change isn't just about feeling modern or trendy, it delivers incredible ROI. It increases innovation through rapid testing. It delivers truly unmatched customer value because you're building what the customer needs today, not what they asked for a year ago. It builds serious business resilience against market shifts. And most importantly, as US government guidance notes, iterative agile delivery is fundamentally far less risky than traditional waterfall models. So, how do you actually implement this whole shebang? Here is your 3-step blueprint. First, maintain a ruthless backlog. It has to be a single, well-groomed list, strictly sorted by value and risk. Second, engage your stakeholders continuously. Don't hide away in a vacuum. Use your sprint reviews to gather immediate, actionable feedback. And third, make risk-based decisions early. Use short iterations to test your absolute biggest assumptions at the very start of the project. Follow this blueprint and you'll stay aligned with what matters most. I'm going to leave you with this absolute truth. Change is inevitable. How you respond to it will define your success. It's time to stop following outdated plans and start planning to learn, adapt, and win. If you want to continue mastering these operational frameworks, I highly urge you to subscribe to Infinite Business Dynamics right now and join the leaders who are actively building the future. Now ask yourself, is your organization prepared to treat your next unexpected disruption not as a crisis, but as your greatest opportunity?
Version 2.
True adaptability requires an architecture and an execution strategy that perfectly merges theoretical empiricism with highly tactical delivery. In today's volatile tech environments, this isn't just about surviving anymore. It's literally about thriving. So let's jump right in. Here's our strategic roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with Part 1, the foundations of adaptability. Then we move to Part 2, empiricism and agile planning. That's followed by a really vital segment in Part 3 on transitioning procurement SOWs. Next, Part 4 tackles operational friction and guardrails. And finally, we'll wrap the whole thing up with Part 5, quantified ROI and your next steps. Section 1, the foundations of adaptability. Let's rewind the clock a bit and compare the realities of 2001 with modern tech architecture. Back in 2001, we had some serious, unavoidable physical constraints. Think about manufacturing and shipping physical CD-ROMs or buying massive, heavy on-premise servers. Those incredibly expensive constraints force us into really rigid, predictive design models. You basically had to guess what the user wanted up front because, well, fixing a mistake required milling out 1 million new disks. It was incredibly painful. But today, cloud-native networks and microservices have slashed deployment costs to near zero. Because of this, the underlying economics of how we build things have totally pivoted. Value creation has shifted away from guessing requirements a year in advance to evolving your product continuously based on actual, real-time telemetry and user data. It's no longer just a good idea, it's an economic mandate to adapt. Now, a lot of business leaders hear adaptability or agile, and their brains immediately picture a complete lack of control. Total chaos, right? But true adaptability is actually highly disciplined. It means treating a delivery plan as a dynamic hypothesis rather than a rigid, unchangeable contract. Teams are systematically inspecting software increments and actively hunting for rapid user feedback to maximize the value they deliver to the client. What it is absolutely not is an excuse for unstructured execution, zero documentation, or just abandoning your architectural guidelines. True agility is vision-guided iterative engineering. It is never just reactive randomness. Section 2, empiricism and agile planning. This entire engine of predictable governance runs on 3 really sturdy pillars: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. Transparency ensures that your metrics, your roadblocks, and your code quality are highly visible to everyone involved. This way, decisions are based purely on cold, hard, factual data, not status assumptions or wishful thinking. Next, inspection means systematically evaluating those product increments at really high frequencies, allowing you to spot any deviations or friction immediately. And finally, adaptation. This means instantly correcting your course, adjusting your processes or your priorities the very moment that inspection reveals a performance divergence. Empiricism completely replaces guessing with facts, letting you course correct way before a tiny deviation snowballs into an incredibly expensive failure. You might be wondering, does planning just disappear in an adaptable framework? Actually, scratch that. It becomes even more rigorous. It just becomes continuous and layered across 5 distinct horizons. Starting at the absolute highest altitude, Horizon 1 is your 1 to 2 year vision. This is the organization's strategic North Star. Moving down to Horizon 2, the 6 to 12 month roadmap maps out flexible outcomes over fixed features. This cascades right down into Horizon 3, which captures incremental delivery targets in 3 to 6 month releases. Then Horizon 4 brings us to the actual execution cadence. These are the 1 to 4 week sprints where goals are locked down tightly inside short iterations to fiercely protect the team's focus. And finally, Horizon 5 is the 24-hour daily sync for micro-tactical pivots. When you look at this timeline, it's clear that Agile provides rigorous, highly predictable governance at absolutely every altitude of your business. Section 3, transitioning procurement SOWs. Okay, this is a massive paradigm shift, especially for the finance and procurement folks tuning in. Traditional predictive statements of work, they are essentially financial straitjackets. They rely on strictly fixed deliverables defined right at the start. So when things inevitably change, and they always do, you fall into these exhausting, expensive request loops and change penalties. It turns into this rigid transactional policing match between suppliers and buyers. Even worse, it demands a massive upfront capital allocation before a single drop of value is ever actually proven. The Agile Adaptive SOM model flips this whole dynamic on its head. Core scope is defined by outcome and capability-driven metrics, not feature checklists. Change protocols are integrated directly through iterative backlog prioritization, so change is expected and managed, not heavily penalized. And the absolute best part for our finance leaders, the funding mechanism shifts from massive upfront allocations to phased, milestone-driven funding. You only fund the next step based on the validated success of the previous one. It's a massive, game-changing reduction in financial risk. Section 4. Operational friction and guardrails. Let's tackle operational friction. Because let's be real, this transition always stirs up some executive anxiety. The biggest fear we hear? Uncontrolled scope creep. We mitigate this by strictly locking the sprint goal inside that short 1 to 4 week iteration while systematically grooming the backlog against really clear commercial values before any new request is allowed in. The biggest myth out there is that Agile means changing your mind every single day. It absolutely doesn't. Requirements do not change mid-sprint. They are triaged for subsequent sprints, providing a rock-solid guardrail for your execution. Then there's stakeholder resistance. Traditional sponsors are so used to those massive, heavy, upfront specification documents. The fix here is transitioning them toward transparent progress demos and output-focused performance reviews. The new standard becomes just enough spec. You are literally showing them working software instead of just telling them about it with theoretical, dusty specifications. Section 5. Quantified ROI and CTA. All right, let's look at the hard numbers because this is exactly why shifting to an adaptive model is an absolute business imperative. Empirical data proves that organizations moving to adaptive models experience a staggering 85% improvement in their product innovation rate. For our project and finance leaders out there, take a close look at the 75% reduction in systemic risk. Why is it so high? Simply because you are validating constantly, instead of crossing your fingers and waiting until the end of a multi-year project. Time to market sees a massive 65% speed gain. And the ultimate bottom line, according to McKinsey, companies embracing these models have a 1.5 times greater financial likelihood of outperforming their peers. These aren't just neat engineering metrics, this is pure quantified business outperformance. I want to leave you with a really powerful thought from Agile co-author Jim Highsmith. He said, "The ability to respond to change is good. The ability to create change for competitors is even better." Adaptability isn't just a defensive maneuver to survive a crazy market, it is an offensive weapon. When you structure your planning, your empiricism, and your contracts to be highly adaptive, you are setting the pace that your competitors must frantically scramble to match. Welcome to Infinite Business Dynamics. Today, we're focusing on one of the absolutely most critical transformations a modern enterprise can make, shifting from rigid predictive forecasting to adaptive, value-driven execution. If you're a project manager, a procurement officer, a finance director, or really any kind of business leader, you already know firsthand just how fast the ground shifts beneath our feet out there. So in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how you can stop fighting that market volatility and start leveraging it to unlock massive enterprise value. To set the stage, take a look at this powerful insight from Agile pioneer Jim Highsmith. He says, "Agility is the ability to adapt and respond to change. Agile organizations view change as an opportunity, not a threat." Now, this isn't just a catchy phrase. This is the foundational mindset shift. For modern leaders, reframing market volatility as a strategic advantage rather than some sort of catastrophic disruption is no longer optional. It's the absolute prerequisite for surviving and thriving. All right, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to start with the historical shift to adaptability, followed by a core comparison between adaptive and predictive planning. Then we'll dive into unlocking those quantifiable performance gains, navigating the very real-world challenges of contracts and procurement, and finally, we'll look at some high-impact case studies of adaptability in action. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, the shift to adaptability, moving from static requirements to reactive loops. To really understand where we're going, we first have to understand the fundamental driver of modern product delivery. The shift away from those standard traditional models, it wasn't just some passing trend. It was prompted by major, painful limitations in structural forecasting. We started with what's known as waterfall inefficiency. In the past, traditional models ran chronically late. Teams would literally spend years constructing these massive, perfectly planned features that, by the time they finally launched, customers never actually ended up using. Total waste, right? Then, boom, the 2001 internet era hits. The explosion of early e-commerce and fast-moving web systems completely broke those old models. They demanded an execution speed that rigid plans just couldn't provide. And today, Well, we face unprecedented modern volatility. Global markets and lightning-fast technological transitions require persistent learning loops. You simply cannot forecast your way out of a market that changes every single week. Moving right along to Section 2, Adaptive versus Predictive Planning. Basically, responding versus following. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast in how change is actually perceived. This is a critical mindset shift. On the left side, we've got responding to change. Agile paradigms actively embrace shifts as avenues for refinement. Teams proactively inspect their results, they conduct retrospectives, and they alter their backlog based on real empirical feedback. The roadmap isn't some sacred text. It exists as a dynamic, living document built entirely around uncertainty. Contrast that with the right side, following a rigid plan. Predictive methods view those original criteria as static constants. Upfront agreements lock everything down, so if a change is needed, the system literally treats it as a structural failure. This inflexible adherence forces teams to develop features they already know will fail to meet current market demands, and that drives down your ultimate business value.
Now, a super common fear among leaders is that adaptability just means chaos. It doesn't at all. It actually relies on highly disciplined, multi-layered planning horizons. Let's break this down. At the macro level, your vision and roadmap provides a course strategic framework. It highlights long-term aims, but it's intentionally kept adaptive. As we move a bit closer, we have midterm release milestones. These are outcome-centric targets that can actually flex based on user shifts. But here is the absolutely crucial anchor: sprint planning. For 1 to 4 weeks, teams enter high-detail commitment cycles where goals stay completely locked. So high-level strategic flexibility safely coexists with locked short-term execution. And finally, daily synchronizations. These provide micro-feedback loops to instantly resolve roadblocks in real time.
All right, Section 3, Unlocking Agile Performance Gains. Let's look at the actual benefits of adaptability. Let's get out of the theory and talk about hard, quantifiable enterprise value. What do you actually gain when you adopt this posture? First up, accelerated innovation. When you embrace adaptability, you generate a safe environment for rapid prototyping, turning sudden user feedback into critical fuel for creative solutions. Second, maximized value. By regularly reprioritizing the backlog, you ensure your expensive work resources are tracking only the highest yield deliverables. You're entirely removing the effort and money spent on obsolete features. And third, minimized failures. By using iterative schedules, you uncover systematic or commercial risks almost immediately. You completely avoid those massive, spectacular launch day failures that are just so endemic to traditional waterfall models. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of the impact we're talking about here. Adopting adaptive over predictive methods directly scales your performance metrics. Organizations utilizing these models see a massive 85% gain in product innovation rate. Systemic risk mitigation skyrockets by 75%. And that makes sense, right? Because you're catching errors in week 2 rather than year 2. And time to market velocity increases by 65%. For the finance and project leaders watching right now, these are the exact numbers that transform a bottom line. Section 4, Navigating Contracts and Challenges, Mitigating Risks and Transitioning Models. Of course, implementation is never without friction. I want to speak directly to the procurement, legal, and finance leaders right now, because operationalizing this mindset requires overcoming some very specific hurdles. 2 of the biggest ones you're going to face are uncontrolled scope creep and stakeholder resistance. On the left, the challenge of scope creep is very real. Constant modifications can lead to project bloating and stretched timelines. The mitigation strategy here? Rigorous discipline. You absolutely must maintain disciplined backlog grooming, strictly validating any proposed changes against clear, overarching value goals before they ever get incorporated. On the right, stakeholder resistance. Look, enterprise sponsors naturally want upfront contractual guarantees, and they tend to resist variable scopes. To mitigate this, you have to implement transparent, regular progress demos. You need to actively reframe your governance models so that sponsors are measuring actual delivered business results rather than just checking off arbitrary milestone dates on a Gantt chart. Now, for procurement and finance, transitioning those procurement contracts is perhaps the most critical operational step in this entire explainer. Under the traditional predictive model, your core scope demands strictly fixed deliverables up front. The Agile adaptive model shifts this completely to outcome and capability-driven statements of work. When a change happens, the traditional model triggers this painfully expensive change requests loop filled with penalties. The adaptive model, it simply integrates the change right into the iterative backlog. No fuss. The traditional supplier dynamic is often highly transactional and based on rigid policing. The adaptive model relies on collaborative, joint execution. You're in it together. And crucially, the funding mechanism shifts from a heavy upfront allocation of capital to a phased, milestone-driven funding model. This minimizes your financial risk while giving you maximum leverage. It's a real game changer.
Let's move to Section 5 and see how this builds into high-impact adaptability in action with some real enterprise case studies. So, how are the world's top innovators actually applying these frameworks out in the wild? Well, take Netflix. They are the absolute masters of deploying content continuously. They don't just sit in a room and guess what viewers might want 3 years in advance. They leverage real-time viewing data to pivot storylines, shift production resources, and adapt viewers' strategies dynamically. This continuous integration of empirical feedback is exactly what drives their massive viewership retention and enterprise dominance. Or consider the NASA rover programs. It's really easy to think that adaptive models are just for software companies, right? But NASA successfully adopted Scrum in highly rigid, safety-critical engineering environments. By breaking down their builds, they drastically shortened delivery timelines and were able to integrate vital telemetry findings mid-build. They literally adapted physical hardware on the fly to meet the harsh realities of space. And finally, Tesla. Tesla's core advantage is that they treat hardware exactly like software. Rather than waiting for a whole new model year to make a minor change, they utilize continuous, factory-wide integrations. They can discover an inefficiency, design a solution, and deploy physical iterations on the assembly line within hours rather than years. That is the sheer power of relentless adaptability. So the crucial point I want to leave you with today as a challenge for your own organization: how will you adapt your plans to learn, iterate, and deliver real value? Are you still rigidly following a plan that's out of date the exact moment it's printed? Or are you actually building the capability to respond to change? Audit your governance, rethink those contracts, and embrace the agility that today's volatility demands. Thank you so much for joining this session of Infinite Business Dynamics. If you found this explainer valuable for your strategic planning, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into enterprise execution. Until next time, stay adaptable.
Imagine a massive, perfectly detailed architectural blueprint for a multi-year project, one that shatters when it encounters the unpredictable variables of the real world. When many industry leaders hear the word agile, they assume it means abandoning that blueprint entirely in favor of zero documentation, zero foresight, and sheer chaos. This bias comes from decades of predictive waterfall project management. We trained generations of managers to believe that heavy, upfront planning was the only reliable mechanism to mitigate risk. But treating a fixed plan as infallible introduces a different kind of risk. It forces development teams to spend months or years building features that are completely irrelevant by the time the product actually launches. In a volatile digital environment, refusing to deviate from a static roadmap is the highest risk strategy an enterprise can adopt. This flaw is exactly why the original architects of the Agile Manifesto included their fourth core value: responding to change over following a plan. Look at the technology of 2001 when this manifesto was written. The early internet era made it clear to software developers that the rapid evolution of technology required a completely different operational mindset. In practice, this means treating project plans as useful baselines while recognizing that adapting to new data, market shifts, or technical discoveries always takes precedence. Agile doesn't eliminate planning. It replaces the brittle, monolithic project schedule with a continuous, multi-tiered planning architecture designed specifically to absorb new data. We are going to examine how this rolling wave architecture works, how it actively defends against scope creep, and how heavy industry giants rely on it for safety-critical missions. Surviving the modern digital economy is not about predicting the future perfectly. It is about structurally preparing your organization to pivot without friction. This animated graphic illustrates the agile, multi-tiered planning stack. Rather than one massive upfront schedule, agile planning happens continuously across 5 distinct horizons. At the top, we have the vision and roadmap levels. These outline long-term goals, but their boundaries are intentionally kept coarse and low resolution so they can flex when the market shifts. Moving down, we reach release planning. Here, major features are scheduled using a prioritized backlog, but the exact scope of those deliverables remains elastic. Finally, at the bottom, we hit sprint and daily planning. This is the micro-horizon. Down here, tasks become highly detailed, rigidly defined, and executed with extreme precision. These tiers operate dynamically. The learnings and technical discoveries generated at the daily and sprint levels feed continuously upward, forcing revisions to the course long-term roadmap. By segmenting planning into these specific time horizons, an organization can execute with absolute precision today while maintaining strategic flexibility for tomorrow. This process relies on rolling wave execution. Instead of predicting the entire project, near-term work is planned in meticulous detail, while future work remains mapped only as a high-level wave that approaches over time. The mechanical engine driving this wave is the sprint, a strict 1 to 4 week cycle. Once a sprint begins, its scope is locked to give the team deep, uninterrupted focus. Between these sprints is the inspect-adapt cycle. Through formal reviews and retrospectives, teams evaluate the latest outcomes and immediately revise the plan for the next iteration based on real-world evidence. This constant revision triggers a major professional fear: scope creep. Managers worry that endless changes will lead to bloated projects and blown deadlines. The agile antidote to scope creep is a rigorously groomed product backlog. An empowered product owner acts as a gatekeeper, balancing every new stakeholder request against strict business value. When new requirements emerge, they aren't simply piled on top of existing work. They are buffered in the backlog and traded out for lower priority items to maintain a sustainable pace. The sprint framework does not invite arbitrary daily chaos. It serves as a highly disciplined container that controls exactly when and how change is introduced into the system. This level of discipline makes adaptive planning viable far beyond software. We can see its actual stress test in heavy manufacturing and strictly regulated aerospace, where failure can be catastrophic. Tesla architects its physical car factories like software. They rely on intense modularity and digital twins to iterate complex hardware rapidly. By combining heavy automation with continuous testing, Tesla deploys physical updates and adapts to consumer demands in a matter of hours, outpacing the multi-year development cycles of traditional automakers. NASA has also adopted Scrum for its highly complex, safety-critical space exploration projects. They use cross-functional sprints to accelerate mission readiness. These short cycles force engineering problems to be identified incredibly early in the timeline, long before they can threaten a launch. During operations, Mars rover teams utilize these iterative cycles to rapidly incorporate brand new scientific discoveries directly into their ongoing software development. If organizations engineering deep space robotics and multi-ton autonomous vehicles rely on Agile to de-risk their work, the methodology is robust enough for any enterprise. Yet, enterprise agility often hits a massive bottleneck: traditional fixed-scope procurement contracts. These legal agreements financially penalize any deviation from the original plan. This comparison diagram shows how locked contracts create a direct adversarial relationship. On the left, the development team needs to adapt to new data, but the traditional contract, acting as a padlock, legally forbids it. The solution on the right is agile procurement. Funding is released incrementally through a phase gate meter. Contracts shift from a rigid list of tasks to an outcome-based structure focusing on achieving specific capabilities. By embedding pre-agreed scenario cost structures into the agreement, suppliers can smoothly pivot their deliverables alongside the internal development team without triggering costly renegotiation delays. True organizational agility is impossible if your legal and financial governance operates on a rigid waterfall model. The entire supply chain must be adaptive. When the entire system is adaptive, we can shift our focus to the ultimate metric of project success: delivering tangible business value, rather than merely conforming to an outdated budget and timeline. Continuous reprioritization ensures that teams never waste months building the wrong thing. Dropping obsolete features entirely eliminates massive amounts of abandoned work. Providing frequent, visible progress updates boosts stakeholder trust. It allows clients to actively influence the final product as market realities inevitably shift around them. Traditional predictive models carry immense large-scale delivery risk. Agile diffuses that risk by surfacing problems early through short, transparent iterations. Treating deviations from the plan as operational assets rather than project failures is the defining characteristic of a resilient business. The Agile mandate of responding to change over following a plan is not a license for chaos. It requires continuous, disciplined, multi-level planning. In an era defined by volatility, clinging blindly to a static blueprint guarantees obsolescence. True agility demands an organizational culture that views shifting variables as strategic opportunities, not as threats to the schedule. Stop trying to predict the future and start building the architecture to adapt to it. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the frameworks at Drive Modern Business. The fourth pillar of the Agile Manifesto prioritizes responding to change over following a plan. This is the architecture of adaptability, a system designed to replace upfront prediction with continuous empiricism to survive volatile environments. In 2001, software was defined by physical distribution. Burning code onto disks and shipping them to stores mandated a predictive design model. Because you couldn't easily update a product once it left the factory, the cost of an error was catastrophic. Modern cloud-native architectures and microservices have slashed deployment costs. When updates can be pushed in seconds, the economic standard shifts from high-stakes anticipation to low-risk iterative evolution. Instead of guessing target requirements months in advance, teams now evolve their products based on real-time user telemetry. This velocity reverses the economic structure of risk. It transforms deployment from a final, speculative event into a continuous source of empirical data. If predictive planning is a liability, why is responding to change so often dismissed as a recipe for chaos? Professional adaptability means treating a plan as a dynamic hypothesis. It is a commitment to testing your assumptions against real-world feedback and emergent telemetry as the work progresses. We have to define the boundary. Adaptability is not a license for chaotic execution, nor is it an excuse to abandon documentation or architectural structure. Agile represents disciplined, iterative execution guided by a clear vision, rather than reactive randomness. By establishing this boundary, leaders can increase their pivot speed without surrendering organizational control. To replace static assumptions, this architecture relies on three cyclical nodes: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. Transparency ensures the actual state of the product and any current blockages are visible to every stakeholder. This forces decisions to be based on data rather than optimistic assumptions. Inspection is the systematic evaluation of progress. Frequent reviews detect deviations, friction, or architectural flaws while they are still small and inexpensive to fix. Adaptation is the corrective pivot. It is the ability to instantly adjust a process, a priority, or a code structure the moment inspection reveals that the product has drifted outside of acceptable ranges. These loops transform market volatility from a threat into the fuel source for creative software solutions. The idea that Agile means no planning is a misunderstanding of the methodology. Agile actually increases the frequency of planning by distributing it across 5 distinct horizons. The outer horizons provide strategic anchors. A product vision looks 1 to 2 years out, while a roadmap provides strategic pathways for the next 6 to 12 months. Both are kept adaptive by design. Closer to the work, release planning sets outcome-centric targets for the next 3 to 6 months, while sprint planning creates high-detail commitment cycles spanning 1 to 4 weeks. To maintain focus, sprint goals are locked inside the short iteration. Any new requirements are triaged in the product backlog for the next cycle. Finally, the daily sync acts as a 24-hour loop for micro-tactical pivots, allowing the team to resolve roadblocks in real time. This structure respects the reality of finite capacity. As Martin Fowler explains, release planning is about deciding which features fit into which iterations. Adding a new feature always requires a decision on what to remove to make room. Distributing planning across these horizons creates a system that remains strategically stable while remaining tactically fluid. The quantitative proof for this model comes from the Standish Group Chaos dataset, which compares the outcomes of Agile and Waterfall frameworks. Traditional predictive methods suffer a 59% failure rate. This is largely due to late-stage integration, where flaws aren't discovered until the end of the project. In contrast, Agile frameworks deliver a success rate of 42%, more than 3 times higher than their predictive counterparts. High-performance engineering correlates directly with financial outperformance. Research from McKinsey shows that adaptive organizations are 1.5 times more likely to achieve top-tier financial results, with decision-making velocity increasing 5 to 10 times over non-agile firms. Choosing an adaptive method is not a cultural preference, it is a measurable performance multiplier. Transitioning to this model often triggers stakeholder resistance. Enterprise sponsors frequently expect upfront contractual guarantees for exact deliverables, even when the market is shifting. Governance must move from strictly fixed deliverables to outcome and capability-driven statements of work. Funding mechanisms must also shift from heavy upfront capital allocation to phased, milestone-driven funding. This moves the supplier dynamic away from rigid policing and toward collaborative execution. Effective governance measures delivered business results rather than adherence to static milestone dates. This architecture is not limited to software. It drives disruption across the most complex physical and digital systems in the world. Netflix uses real-time telemetry to pivot storylines and content strategies dynamically based on viewer data. NASA adopted Scrum for safety-critical engineering, allowing them to integrate telemetry findings mid-build and shorten delivery timelines for planetary rovers. Tesla treats physical hardware exactly like software, utilizing factory-wide integrations to deploy hardware iterations within hours rather than years. These examples prove the architecture of adaptability scales to the most complex, safety-critical environments on Earth. Adaptability is an offensive strategy. By empowering cross-functional teams, such as Amazon's 2 pizza squads, firms can create continuous iterations that outpace the market. This leverages Conway's Law, the principle that a system's design is a reflection of the organization's communication structure. By decentralizing the technology into adaptive microservices, the organization itself becomes more modular and responsive. As Jim Highsmith notes, the ability to respond to change is good, but the ability to create change for competitors is even better. Adaptive organizations view change as an opportunity, not a threat. Look at your own organizational structure. Are you following a plan that has already become obsolete? Or are you building the architecture to respond to what is happening right now?